Hello, anatomy colleagues. This is Dr. Alsop, and in this video, we will be discussing the details of the composition of spinal nerves. So after this video, the goal is to be able to differentiate between the different parts of the spinal nerve and gain the ability to explain how spinal nerves are named. So get a handle on those abbreviations that you're going to see all year. Spinal nerves receive fibers that originate from the gray matter in the spinal cord. Recall, gray matter is predominantly cell bodies, and when we're talking about in the spinal cord, it's located internally within the tissue of the spinal cord. And there are two major gray matter horns that all together really end up looking like a butterfly. You often hear it referred to as like the gray matter butterfly. The spinal cord ventral horn is composed of somatic motor nuclei, and from here, ventral rootlets will um, will exit through this region, and the horn as well as the rootlets are entirely motor. So they are entirely motor when we're talking about the ventral horn as well as the ventral rootlets. The dorsal horn is composed of axons of incoming sensory neurons as well as cell bodies of interneurons, and the dorsal rootlets arrive here transmitting action potentials from peripheral receptor organs to that spinal cord. So this horn and rootlets, these dorsal horns as well as the dorsal rootlets, are entirely sensory. Now, the rootlets are part of the peripheral nervous system, but you can see or you can conceptualize how interconnected they are to the spinal cord. And remember, the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. The roots will coalesce, or excuse me, the rootlets will coalesce to form roots. Since the ventral rootlets were composed entirely of motor axons, the ventral root will also be entirely motor. So specific damage to just the ventral root of a spinal nerve would only present as motor deficits to areas innervated by that specific spinal cord segment. And the opposite is true of the dorsal roots. Damage to just the dorsal root would present as only sensory deficits to areas innervated by that spinal cord segment, as dorsal roots are entirely sensory or afferent. Now, speaking of the dorsal root, there is something unique present that you do not find on the comparable partner on the ventral root. And this is going to be the dorsal root ganglion, or the DRG. Now, the DRG presents as a swelling on the dorsal root, and it contains cell bodies of sensory neurons. Recall, the definition of a ganglion is a collection of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system, which is certainly what is happening here. The presence of the dorsal root ganglion explains why the ventral horn is always going to be larger than the dorsal horn, because all of the cell bodies of the motor neurons are in the ventral horn, whereas the dorsal horn has cell bodies also in this DRG, or dorsal root ganglion. The ventral and dorsal roots on each side of the spinal cord correspond to one developmental segment, and as they continue to project laterally, they will eventually converge to form the trunk of the spinal nerve. Now, many people call this simply the spinal nerve, but keep in mind all of these things that are projecting laterally from the spinal cord are parts of the spinal nerve. Now, since the ventral root is bringing those motor axons and the dorsal root, it has those sensory axons, it is at this point that this portion of the nerve is considered mixed, meaning that it contains both motor as well as sensory fibers. Recall in our discussion in the afferent and efferent video, I told you to assume that unless otherwise noted, all nerves should be assumed to have both afferent and efferent fibers. And it is at this point in the trunk of the spinal nerve and distal, so beyond this point, that that is true. The trunk of the spinal nerve exits the vertebral column at the intervertebral foramina, which you'll have at each segment or each portion of the vertebral column. So you'll have one on the right side and you'll have one on the left side. The trunk of the spinal nerve is actually quite short. It almost immediately splits into two primary rami, which means first branches. These branch either within the intervertebral foramina or just distal to it. And these are still mixed nerve branches containing both motor and sensory fibers. So if you were to damage a primary ramus, that would likely present as both motor and sensory deficits to that region. The dorsal primary rami, or the DPR, are typically is the less important of the two types of primary rami, and it's only because it just has a much more limited area of coverage. So this includes deep back muscles, some but not all of the vertebral joints, and the skin of the back. Additionally, the DPR rarely form plexuses, which we'll talk a bit more about on the next slide. So I wanted to mention the DPR, but again, it's really the ventral primary rami, or the VPR, that are where it's at. We will be talking about VPRs all year as they are more clinically significant due to coverage. Most of the named nerves we will discuss this year that are not cranial nerves are derived from ventral primary rami. And that makes sense. These nerves innervate a much wider area of coverage, including all parts of the limbs, the anterior regions of the neck, thorax, and abdomen, as well as the superficial musculature of the posterior back. And so this includes musculature, and these also include the areas of the skin. Now, the axons from the ventral primary rami of the spinal nerves do not go directly to the body structures that they innervate, except for in the thoracic spinal nerves. Instead, most of the ventral primary rami form networks on both sides of the body by joining with various numbers of axons from the ventral rami of those adjacent spinal nerves. And this is called a plexus. You have many major plexuses in the body. You have cervical, brachial. We'll spend a lot of time on this one. Those will supply regions of the upper limb, and neck, etc. And then you'll also have the lumbar and the sacral plexuses. So most named nerves derived from spinal nerves have axons from more than one spinal cord level. So much, much more to come on plexuses throughout the year, but I just wanted to introduce this concept here. Each pair of spinal nerves are derived from a spinal cord segment. Within the spinal cord, this segmentation is actually not really obvious, although there are some ways to distinguish we'll talk a little bit about in neurology, but they are divided into 5 regions, which actually also correspond to the 5 vertebral regions. But it's important to note that all spinal cord segments, not all spinal cord segments are aligned with their corresponding vertebrae because of the differential growth of the vertebral column and the spinal cord. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and you can see how this amount doesn't align perfectly with the amount of vertebrae. There are 8 cervical spinal nerves, and there are only 7 cervical vertebrae. That C1 spinal nerve actually exits the vertebral column between the skull and the first cervical vertebrae. There are 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, and 5 sacral. That actually does align with the amount of vertebrae in those regions. And you can see how these would be numbered. The spinal nerves would be numbered. And there's only 1 coccygeal spinal nerve, CO1. Excellent. We have reached the spinal nerve summary slide. An understanding of the spinal nerve is very foundational, so do make sure you feel good about what we covered here. And as always, please reach out if you have any questions. Thank you for your time.